And welcome to another Bangers and Classics podcast. We're still going strong with me, James Ruppert, and him, David Malloy. And what's David been up to?
Not too much, James, this and that. First of all, I think I'd just like to say or pay tribute to the late Carlos Reutemann, who sadly passed away earlier this week. Formula One driver, hailed from Argentina, was a very, very gifted driver, never won the World Championship, but certainly had the talent to do so. And he then went into politics and could have stood to be the president of Argentina. In fact, I believe pressure was put upon him, or certainly he was requested to stand for it several times and decided not to. But a very interesting chap. There's a couple of stories I'd like to share about him, James, but have you got anything to say about Carlos? I believe you may have seen him race.
May well have done. I can't quite place it. I could have done. I certainly saw him practice, but he was an old school racing driver. He looked like a racing driver, as they used to look. They used to look like real men, and not like sort of boys in caps that they seem to look like now. But that's probably my great age. And he was all about driving, really. And he seemed to be very exceptional at it. Great name, great look, and he was part of an era for me.
Yeah, definitely. He had the traditional Latin temperament, and that possibly held him back a little bit, because when he was at the top of his game, he was absolutely majestic. There were days that he didn't somehow manage to put in the level of performance he was capable of, and only he would have known why that was. But nonetheless, he was a hugely gifted driver, and it is a sad day. A couple of tales about him, though, that perhaps give some insight into his character. And the first one is from 1982. It was the last season he drove. He retired after 2 races. But the first race of the season was in South Africa. He was driving at Williams at the time. He'd moved there from Lotus for 1980, and before that he did a couple of years at Ferrari. Anyway, he's there for Williams. It's during practice, and it's a lunchtime, and a spectator was mooching around the paddock, as you could in those days, and spots Reutemann coming out of the Ferrari area with a big plate full of Italian food. Well, no surprise, because apparently his mum was Italian. But anyway, the spectator sort of said to him, "I thought you didn't drive for those guys anymore." And Reutemann just laughed and said, "Their food's better." And off he went. So there you go. So that was one story. Perhaps more telling, I think, is this one. That he lost the 1981 World Championship in the last race of the season literally in the car park at Caesar's Palace. That's where the Grand Prix was held. Yeah. Believe it or not, it was held in the car park of a casino. Crazy idea, but not a bad race as it turned out. Anyway, all he had to do to win the championship was finish ahead of Nelson Piquet, comfortably ahead of him in qualifying. Unfortunately, during the race, I think he had a problem with his car, and he just slipped back through the field, and Piquet passed him. And Piquet beat him to the championship by 1 point, a solitary point. And after the race, a journalist said to Reutemann, well, he said, look, when Piquet was coming past you, trying to get past you, why didn't you just sort of nudge him off, and the championship would have been yours, even if you were out the race too. I mean, after all, nobody would have known. And Reutemann fixed the journalist straight in the eye and said, I would have known. There you go. He wasn't prepared to sacrifice his principles just for something as tawdry as a championship. And one final story. 1995, the Argentinian Grand Prix returned to the country after an absence of quite a few years. And I think Reutemann was the president. He was the governor of Santa Fe, I think, at that time. He certainly had been. In any event, he's there. Ferrari invite him to take out one of their cars, one of the cars that's being used in the race, a modern Ferrari, and do a few demonstration laps, because there's no Argentinian drivers, or if there were at the time, I can't really remember off the top of my head, but certainly there were none of Reutemann's level. So Reutemann gets into the Ferrari. He's not used to it. He hasn't driven a Formula One car in 13 years. Takes it out and then starts circulating at a ridiculous speed. He's in his 50s by this point. Hasn't driven, as I say, in a long time. Not used to the car. And he's right on the money. And that is the level of the guy. That's the sheer amount of natural talent he had. They could step into a car, and these, as I say, this is a Formula One car of the mid-90s. They were not easy to drive. They were a bit more difficult, shall we say, than today's machines. And Reutemann was right on the money. So that's the level of talent the man had. And, well, he'll certainly be missed. And, I think race fans all across the world will pay tribute to him and to his talent. And I certainly hope they do.
Absolutely.
Moving on from that sad news, let's talk about car spots. What have we seen this week? Well, I've got one for you, James. And this is a bit worrying. Remember the MX-5 I saw last week, the green one? with the hard top that's been lowered.
That's right.
I passed it again yesterday, and it had one headlight down and one headlight up. And I thought, oh my God, they really are trying to copy Lotus now, aren't they? Except of course, the marginal and the M100 never did anything as vulgar as that. But the MX-5, I thought, they really have been studying old Lotuses. What have you seen, James?
I've seen tons of stuff, actually. There's an awful lot of VW campers about. Obviously, everybody's going camping, and they're taking their campers with them. So it's mainly the later ones and even some of the more modern T4 type ones. But there just seems to be every corner I turn, there's one coming the other way with a beaming family in it, obviously going to go somewhere. So that's quite heartening in a way. I had quite a strong wave the other day from a Fred Dibner spec Land Rover 2A because I was in mine, and I say Fred Dibner spec. We did speak about him the other day, but it did have a ladder lashed to it, and I don't know whether it was for show. But it did look as though it was a hard-working vehicle, so maybe he was going to shin up a chimney at some point in the day. But he seemed quite pleased to see me, which was good. A Mini, which I don't see very many of at all, had a checkered roof. It was a 90s Mini, one of those, and it either had a hole in the exhaust or a cherry bomb exhaust, and that was quite fun to see. But probably one of the best spots was actually a Bentley Continental, which belongs to a friend of mine, which I've seen it outside his garage a few times, and it was inside, and I popped in the other day to see it and him. And yes, it was 1996 Bentley Continental that he picked up at trade money. It was quite cheap because there were some issues with it, but he owns a garage, so that's not a problem. But there was no history with it, so he really got it for buttons apparently. But the thing was, he found the history. So, and the phrase he used, "It's better to be born lucky rather than rich." And so he immediately doubled what the car's worth. He's keeping it as a plaything. He's not going to resell it or anything. And also, the added bonus is it's a limited edition. It was built to celebrate 60 years of Bentley. So it sort of gets better and better and better for him. But he's a realist, and he knows that if anything goes wrong, it's not going to be easy. But he's a very clever bloke, and he will be able to sort it out. But just to give you an idea, the brake discs are carbon fibre, and they're £7,000 each. So you'd better not compromise better not scuff those. I'm sure it's very difficult to break them, but if you do, then you're going to be in for an awful lot of money. So that was quite. But also the things now, you often hear from people who criticise vehicles because they're parts bin specials. But he said, yeah, it is a parts bin special. It really is like an Audi A8 to drive. So it isn't that comfortable. And also he does play the spot the VW Golf switch gear inside. So all those cliches that you hear people say, they are actually true. But he said it was a car that he sort of had to have. And it's one for high days and holidays. He'll just do a few thousand miles in it, and it will always be worth more than he paid. So he's quite happy about it, and I think he just quite likes the idea of having a Bentley, like most of us would. It'd be just quite an interesting thing to have, but you've got to be aware of the realities of it all. But it's a very pretty car up close, and it was one of the last of the Mark I style, and I think after that they sort of spoilt it. It was quite a good shape, and we the Bangers and Classics Massive should always point out to car designers that they should leave certain designs alone. There's no point putting a dimple or a crease or another thing, or making things better, because you just make them worse. Once you've got a perfect design, stick with it, and that pretty much is. But you may disagree, David.
No, not at all, not at all. Only one thing is, I'm not sure it's 60 years of Bentley, James, because they were going long before 1936.
Well, it was 60 years of something, because it's a 60. Yeah. There is actually a little tiny badge on it.
Right.
It's very hard to spot, and it says 60 on it. So
yeah.
No, I do agree with you. But that's what it says. But maybe because it's the Germans, they just made things up. I don't know. It could be, couldn't it?
I better not go down the line I was thinking there. We'll just edit that bit out. Talking of special editions, this is
Yeah.
still for sale at the time of writing.
Mm.
It's a Lotus. It's a pre-production Milan M100. It's pre-production number 13. I've actually driven PP14, which was the British Motor Show car, the launch car in '89. This one is the Tokyo Motor Show car from the same year. It's been refettled. It looks resplendent in Calypso red. Lots of work done to it. Lots of good new things. And it's for sale on Auto Trader just now.
Mm.
I'm surprised it's not been snapped up. I have to say, the price is I think it's fairly reasonable, to be honest, given its provenance. The only problem is it's a non-turbo version. And the turbo snobs will say, oh, it's not fast enough. Well, it's not about speed. In actual fact, it probably handles better than the original because it's got a little bit less weight over the front wheels. So it actually improves the balance of the car a little bit. And you don't have any turbo problems. You don't have to worry about your wastegate actuator seizing if you don't use it for a couple of months, that kind of thing. If you're interested in buying an M100, and frankly, you should be, if this is still for sale, go to Auto Trader, check it out. It's £12,750 and it's pre-production 13. I'm sorely tempted to buy it myself, so please, for goodness sake, somebody buy it before I go and do it, because I've had 5 of the things and I vowed not to get another one, and my resolve was being sorely tempted, so please save me from that.
Absolutely. But maybe we should buy it, David, and give it away in one of those competitions we do from time to time. I mean, it'd be much better than a book, wouldn't it? You know, we get loads of interest.
I don't know. I mean, I think our books are pretty good, James. They're worth 12,000 quid of anyone's money. This is Bangers and Classics, the motoring podcast presented by the sartorially elegant James Rupert and his sidekick David Malloy, who resembles Stig of the Dump on Dress Down Friday. Well, welcome back, and I believe Mr. Rupert is now going to tell us about an interesting car that was sold at auction. Over to you, James.
Well, yeah, I wouldn't normally want to talk about a Ford Escort Ghia from 1981, but it belonged to Princess Diana. It was bought for her by Prince Charles, and it sold at auction. It sold for 47,000 quid plus commission. David knows where it's gone because he's done proper research. In the days when I did proper research, I actually went and saw the car. It was it was on the East Anglian Riviera, better known as Scrapby. Oh, what a fantastic name for a place. But my auntie Flo used to live near to Yarmouth, and this shop was sort of just down the road from her. And I remember going in there to buy a paper or a pint of milk or something, and there was like a huge display, and there was an Escort that belonged to Princess Diana. I mean, it was the most incongruous thing you would ever see. You've just gone into a mini mart, and there's a Ford Escort in there, and I spoke to the chap there, and he took it outside, and I took a picture. And I think the story appeared somewhere or other in the classic car universe of the time. Now, this would have been mid to late 90s. I can't remember the actual date. But at the time, he'd been trying to sell it to a casino in Las Vegas. And they were going to pay. Do you want to guess how much they wanted to pay, David? It was slightly more than £47,000. Or maybe it was less. I don't know.
I don't know. I'll go for $199,000.
Yeah, that sounds about right. No, it was $1.5 million. So that was $1990. But obviously, it didn't go through. But that's how much he expected for it. And at the time when I was speaking to him, he still thought he could get a 6-figure sum for it. So he was a very interesting gentleman. He basically owned the sort of village of Scrapby. He had lots of enterprise. He was pretty much an Arthur Daly, but a very nice chap. This was one of the things. The vehicle itself was actually sold at auction. It was a Daily Mail prize. The Daily Mail got hold of the car, then they offered it as a prize, and he bought it at auction for 5,000 quid. So I don't know if he was the one selling this, or it's moved on quite a few through several hands. I've no idea. But it was an interesting car to see at the time. He even had a bust of Princess Diana, which came from what's that place?
Madame
Madame
Tussauds.
Tussauds. Yeah. He actually bought one of those, and he used to put it in the car. But after she passed away, he thought that was rather, it wasn't the right thing to do. So he retired that. But it was possible in one part of East Anglia to go and see Princess Diana's Ford Escort Ghia. And it had on it as well what made it distinctive was not the gear spec, but the fact that it had a frog in the middle of the bonnet, which apparently was I think was bought for by her sister. I think it was something to do with kissing frogs and getting princes and some extended joke like that. But that was still on the vehicle. But I'm quite pleased that you've paid 47,000 quid for it, David. And I wonder what you were going to do with it next.
Oh, well, that's it. Me being a sort of eccentric millionaire that I am. We're going to give it away in a Bangers and Classic competition, aren't we? Well, we would if we owned it, but the reality, sadly, is that it's gone to Chile. Apparently, Princess Diana has a very large following in Chile. A guy I was at school with lives and works in Chile. Depends where the museum is, but perhaps we could prevail upon him to go and give us a condition report on it. He'll probably tell me to bog off, but we can always ask and see how it's going. The frog basket you saw wasn't the original, James.
All right.
I believe that Diana kept the original. It was indeed a gift from her sister, and it was the princess and the frog. As I understand it, the vendor was a lady who was a great fan of Princess Diana. I'm not sure how long she owned the car for, but she certainly seems to have used it, but kept quiet about its provenance. Probably just didn't want the attention. She just liked the idea of driving a car that Diana had once driven. And anyway, she's parted company with it now, and it's going to Chile. So I'm sure people will enjoy seeing it over there. But yeah, another part of history leaves the country, which is, I suppose, quite sad in a way, really.
No, absolutely.
But anyway, moving on from former royal cars to something I think is still quite regal, and you may disagree in this because it's time for Banger or Classic.
Oh, okay.
And this week's car is, cue drum roll, or possibly it's an egg roll. It's the Lancia Beta.
Right.
All right, James. What do you reckon?
Well, I think you did have some constraints on this. Are we talking about because it did come in many flavors, didn't it?
Yeah, not the Monte Carlo. We're going to exclude the Monte Carlo. Monte Carlo was never really a Beta. It started life as a Fiat X18 prototype, then became the X120, and last minute, literally before it was launched in 1975, the decision was made to make it a Lancia rather than a Fiat, and for marketing reasons, they gave it the Beta prefix. The first series cars had that, but if you know the Lancia Beta Monte Carlo history, the Lancia Monte Carlo history, I should say, then it was pulled off the market to sort out braking problems that bizarrely took 2 years to fix when it was a very simple job. It came back, and it was now known simply as the Lancia Monte Carlo. But it's not a Beta, so great car. I really, really, really do like the Monte Carlo, but for me, it's not a Beta. But all the other cars we can talk about, and that includes the Trevi, are Betas. So fire in there.
Well, yeah, I mean the Beta looked like a hatch, didn't it? And it wasn't. It was a good old fashioned saloon, and that was the body shell that they put on a sort of a craggy rock. I don't know if you ever remember those adverts where Lancia had to say, we don't rust any more than anyone else. And I thought they put a body shell on a windswept. It could have been near you, David. Off the coast of Scotland.
Probably my back garden in the winter.
Yeah, it could be. But that's what I thought that they did. I don't know if you remember. I might be the only person who remembers it. It's a bit like you with the old Seat ad. But yeah, there was an advert where they put a body shell, a body in white, actually. And it was sort of next to a lighthouse. So it was a proper craggy rock story place to keep something. But that doesn't get away from the fact that apart from rust, which every car in the 1970s and 80s and 60s and 50s rusted to nothing. It doesn't matter where it came from and what it was, but they got a bad reputation for it, which was a bit unfair, really. But the car itself was very nice. It was front wheel drive, wasn't it? Transverse engine and all that sort of stuff, and it was just a lovely car to drive, and sort of showed up a lot of British cars which were quite dull by comparison. It was nice to drive, spacious, and it looked really quite executive and stylish, wasn't it?
It was a very classy looking car. A neighbour across the road when I was a kid had one in a very unflattering brown colour. But even then, the elegance of its looks showed through. That was the Berliner, which was obviously the fastback model.
Yeah.
But all Betas, I mean, look at the specification, James. 1972 came out. All of them, including the 1.3 litre, had double overhead camshaft engines. Where were we? The British motor industry. What were we punting out? It's shocking, really.
Coupe.
Yeah, exactly. Independent suspension all round, front wheel drive, and that gorgeous body shell. And then that was just a Berliner. The next year, 1973, they brought out a coupe, a very attractive coupe, another good-looking car. Then they went one better. They brought out a Spider, which was a convertible version, essentially, of the coupe 74. Then they thought, well, we could do with a hatchback.
Yeah.
So they brought out a shooting brake, the HPE, or High Performance Estate, in 1975. And by this time you're thinking, well, that's quite a range of cars. You've got just about every single base covered. But they didn't stop there. Obviously, we're going to exclude the Monte Carlo. But then they brought out the Trevi, which was a proper notchback, a traditional three-box shape in 1980 with the infamous Swiss cheese dashboard, which later Betas got. But they topped the whole thing off by bringing out some supercharged models. Over here, I think it was probably only the HPE. I can only ever remember the HPE with the Volume X engine, as it was called. But so they brought out a supercharged version as well. So they did a whole raft of great things in those cars. But yeah, they did rust. There was a story that they were built from rubbish steel that Russia basically traded to Italy in exchange, or in part exchange, for building a car plant, for Fiat building a car plant. That story is cobblers. I'm informed reliably that it is absolute nonsense. It's just an urban myth. And as you say, James, it's just a typical 1970s failure by manufacturers to properly guard against rust. And the Beta was no better or no worse than most of the cars on the road at the time. But, you give a dog a bad name and it sticks. So it comes down to the essential question. Are we talking about a classic or a banger? I'm just going to say two words. Hell yes, it's a classic.
Well, yeah, I would, I mean, if anybody's got any doubts in what we've just discussed, really, I mean, if anybody wants to call it a banger, I mean, they should be hauled before the highest court in the land, David, and you should adjudicate on their fate.
No,
really, isn't it?
No, let's just go for the underground garage approach that you talked about a couple of weeks back. Okay. We'll sort them out down there.
Right.
So yeah, that's it. No, it's a great car. And if you get a chance to own one, make sure get it properly rust protected. But for goodness sake, if you get one at a reasonable price, buy it. They're fantastic, and that's all that we need to say about it. And on that note, we'll move on to another break. You're listening to the Bangers and Classics podcast with James Three Lions Rupert and David Lion Bar Malloy. Welcome back, and I'm just recovering after James broke a picture came over my head after I insulted a certain car, not realising he'd get married in it, so you'll forgive me if I'm a bit wounded sounding. He's a very temperamental man, Mr. Rupert, a very passionate man. Don't want to upset him. Anyway, moving away from cars, we're going to look at something that's a design classic. It's not a banger classic, but it's a design classic, and that's the Rally Chopper. James and I both have experience of these because we have the right sort of age to have that, and I think James should kick off this one.
Well, yeah, I mean, you can kick off with me because I never owned one. I never wanted to own one, and I thought they were terrible to drive. There you go. I used to drive bikes. I never rode bikes. I drove, and in a way, that's what you were supposed to do. I mean, I can see it as a triumph of style over real substance. I mean, it wasn't really a bike; it was for showing off. Really, it was what the rich kids got for Christmas and their birthdays, and you would ride them, and you'd go, yeah, okay. You could get a mate on the back. Okay, changing gear was a novelty for 5 minutes, but really, I mean, the hard kids like me, we had proper bikes, and we'd leave the chopper the chopper wannabes way behind. You know, it just didn't add up for us. But yeah, I do understand that they looked the part. I understand what they were getting at. But really, it is a design classic. I do like it. I do like the look of it, and yeah, it would be fun to look really stupid and ride one around. But I honestly, from a 1970s perspective, because David and I are very, very old.
Well, you are. I'm not.
Well, you speak for yourself, David. But
I do.
but yeah, we saw them at the time, and actually, in context, in 1970, they probably made some sort of sense. But you know, now they are sort of retro foolish things for people to pay. I don't know. They cost a frightening amount of money.
A few £100, I reckon.
Yeah, that's right. So from my point of view, no, it didn't measure up because I was one of those snobby kids. Whereas you, David, I don't know. Maybe you owned one. I don't know.
You know, he knows I own it. He's just getting his revenge in quickly there for the comments I just made off here. Yeah, I owned a chopper. Before I wasn't a rich kid, but I didn't have any brothers or sisters, so it meant, I kind of got a little bit more at Christmas, I suppose. I got it at Christmas, I'll tell you what it was. It was Christmas 1973. I didn't have a bike up to that point, and I learned to ride on the chopper. There was an old railway line behind the house. It was a sort of cutting, long disused, and that's where I learned to ride safely. I can still remember that to this day. Mine, the colour was ultraviolet. It was a shocking purple colour. It was a Mark II chopper, so the gear lever on it looked like a bit of an automatic selector, as opposed to sort of manual gear lever, as it were, on the Mark I. A little bit of history for people who don't know much about the chopper. Basically, it's a kind of kids' take or kids' bike take on, say, a chopper motorcycle. I think Easy Rider on the right lines. It was inspired by American motorbikes and by a company called Schwinn, who made a bicycle that had that sort of style. I'll come back to that because there's a kind of controversy over who designed it. It came out in 1970. The banana seat, as they called it, 3-speed gears. There were 5 speeds, and I even believe a 10-speed. I've never seen one of those. Never saw them back in the day. I didn't even know they existed till I was researching this. There were some questions about the safety of the original chopper because the seat was quite far back, and if you sat really right back at the end of the seat, the front end went very light, and you could get up. You could get the front wheel up in the air, no trouble at all. And sometimes you might go proverbial over proverbial on it. So they moved that. They redesigned it slightly for the Mark II. They moved the seat forward and put a tray behind it. Gave it sort of a gear lever, looked a bit like an automatic car. And that, guys, it lasted for some years. I think it was killed off in the early 80s by the BMX craze. And I have to say, I thought it was a great bike. It was too heavy. It was slow. It was ungainly. And, I crashed mine quite a few times. One occasion, and I'm not even going to tell you the circumstances in which I crashed it because it's so embarrassing. It really is. But for the second time in a week, I ended up in the emergency part, the A&E part of the Children's Hospital for a chest x-ray because of it. Maybe a head x-ray might have been better. Some might say, but we're not going to go down that route. But it was utterly fantastic as a kid to own one of those things. And, I'm glad that I did. But as I say, there's some controversy over who designed it. Now, we're not going to get into that by taking sides. It was either the chief designer of Raleigh, Alan Oakley, or Tom Cameron of Ogle Design. Both of those have laid claim to have designed it. Alan Oakley is no longer with us, and Tom Cameron still is. He's a good age. He's a very famous designer, designed the Bond Bug and many other cars. One of my design heroes, in fact, actually. But there is some dubiety over who designed it, and there's certainly competing claims. Well, it's certainly worth looking into, researching yourself, and perhaps drawing your own conclusions. But a fantastic bike, and don't listen to Mr. Ruppert on this one. It really was good. So, you want to have the last word on that one, James?
Well, not really. If you're stupid enough to go and buy one for a few £100 and then fall off, then don't come crying to me. Go crying to David.
That's it.
He'll look after you.
That's it. Yeah. We'll do it. We'll probably feed you to the dogs or something. Well, since we've talked about one British design classic, shall we talk about something that wasn't a design classic? It was also hailed from these islands, and that is the Sinclair C5. Remember those, James?
Absolutely. Yeah. No. I remember the launch extremely clearly. They actually drove them around Grosvenor Square, which was very near to where I worked, and yeah, they were ridiculous.
I mean, Clive Sinclair. Again, if people of a younger age don't know who he was, or I think he's still with us, Clive.
Yeah,
But early 80s, he brought out various things. His big break, I suppose, was the ZX81 computer, which was black and white and had no sound. But hey, was cheap, got a lot of people interested in computers. That was followed up by a colour model that had sound called the Spectrum. And these things sold like hotcakes. He was really doing fantastically well in terms of sales, in terms of profile. And then he made a couple of big mistakes, as I see it anyway. First, he decided to make his new computer a bit more upmarket, a bit more aimed at the business sector, with a machine called the QL. A friend of mine actually had one. Said it was a good machine, but really it just never took off. It basically just didn't get the sales that Sinclair had envisaged for it, and to that extent it was a flop. But if that was a flop, the C5 was a disaster. Basically, you could say it was ahead of its time in some respects, and I'll say why in a minute.
yeah.
But I think James would agree on this. It was slow, it was vulnerable, it had a lack of endurance from the battery. I think Sinclair, thought that if you released a car and they get popular, better batteries will come along. Well, that didn't happen, at least at that point. And there was really no weatherproofing for the occupants, and it was a huge flop. They actually, at one point, were paying youth to go around towns or cities in them, try and drum up business. And it didn't work. Within a very short time, the makers went into receivership. All I'll say in its defence is, and maybe you might agree with this, maybe you won't, James, it's kind of, I suppose, an 80s version of the electric bike that we've now got. You pedalled it, though you sat in it and not on it, and it was a tricycle rather than a two-wheel bike. But it had basically some of the hallmarks of the modern-day electric bikes. And possibly in that sense, he saw a gap in the market, but he was just maybe a couple of decades too early. Would you think that would be a fair comment?
I think you're absolutely bang on there, David. Yes, I mean, if it was launched last week, I mean, people would be terribly excited by it. It would have some motor manufacturer logo on it. You know, it would have a Skoda logo on it or a Seat logo on it. And it would be championed in the same way that we're now being inflicted with these electric scooters. That's purely all it is. It's a scooter, but you're sitting down, and actually, it might even be safer to ride along. Compared to this modern stuff. So yeah, he was far too early with it. It was the way it was marketed, and I know it was also to tap into 16-year-olds, wasn't it, and below. Couldn't you ride it from 14 even? I think that may have been it. I think he thought, oh, a lot of people want to go to school on one of these instead of waiting for the bus. But obviously, if you were a parent at the time, you wouldn't want your youngster to be in one of those sort of death traps. So yeah, it was a vehicle sort of ahead of its time, and people would welcome it now, but they just laughed it off then. But it doesn't make the electric scooter craze correct, because we could spend many hours saying what's wrong with that and what the intention is. Because they are talking about the last mile, and in some respects, maybe a C5 would be great for the last mile of your journey, and you could tuck it under your arm and take it into the office, or take it into your front room or something. But yeah, it was a very odd thing at the time. It was the wrong thing to be. It should never have been called a car, because it wasn't a car, was it? I think that's part of it. I think it was before it came out. Oh, Sinclair's going to bring out a car, and I think that is what threw everybody off, because it certainly wasn't a car, was it? It was more of a recumbent cycle than anything.
Yeah. I think he called it a vehicle rather than a car. I think he was he himself was was aware of that difficulty, but unfortunately, perhaps the marketing people didn't get the memo, or certainly the press didn't. It was going to be Sinclair's new car, and it wasn't. It was sadly, it was an unmitigated disaster. I think they made about 14,000 of them.
Yeah,
all told. So there's still some out there.
Yeah, I mean, you could buy them after, fairly cheaply, because I think they were relatively expensive. They were 400 or 500 quid, and then you could buy them. They were in like the back of newspapers in the classified section. You could get them for about 100 quid or 50 quid. and because it was because they had a link up with Hoover, didn't they? Because I think
That's
Hoover
right,
would
yeah.
service them or sell them. You could buy them in a Comet store or something. But yeah, it was a strange time, and these days it might not be a silly thing to have.
Well, you could have one for the grounds of Chateau Robert.
Absolutely, I could go around
That's
my
it.
compound in that.
That's it. Well, you probably wouldn't get around all the grounds. You run out of battery power really before you got to the end of the driveway, James. Obviously, the dimensions of your abode, but yeah, it might be fun to have. Again, it's not a vehicle to be used on the open road, though.
No,
It's really, it wasn't then, and it really isn't now.
no,
And that's it. But it was an interesting idea, and
yeah,
we're not going to insult anyone for trying. And Clive Sinclair certainly tried. He just came up with possibly a good idea in one sense, but at the wrong time.
as you say, yeah, he was a very, very clever bloke, and he deserves
Absolutely.
an awful lot of credit for what he did, and he did get a lot of people into computing.
Yeah.
And as you say, at least he tried. He
Yeah,
tried.
we rather like Clive here. We don't
Yeah, we do.
we don't mind him.
No.
Even though I was more of a Commodore guy back in the 80s when I programmed. Anyway, James, it's British Grand Prix soon. We could do a feature about that, but I think we'll save it for another day. The bangers and classic driver ratings, because I think I'm probably enough hot water with the MX5 Owners Club still after me, and probably the 911 Owners Club still after you. So we'd probably better leave that for another day.
Well, also, I have to go out and find out what Formula One is, David, as well. Modern Formula One, I have no idea.
Sadly, the days of the Carlos Reutemanns, etc., and real cars and real tracks is pretty much past. And I'm afraid those days, they ain't coming back. However, at least we're getting some competition this year. At least there's a bit of a battle for the championship, and that's good. Any sport, no matter how rubbish it might seem to be, is always much more interesting if there's competition. And for the first time in a few years, we've got proper competition in F1. So there's always that to be thankful for. On that slightly upbeat note, I'll say thanks very much for listening to the podcast this week. Hopefully you tune in next time.
See you soon. I'm off to play with David's chopper.